Mantra Meditation versus Buddhist Meditation by Venerable Rungruan Papa Saro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patapa. Traditionally before the Buddha time, the mantra meditation was the way to perform the meditation. However, the Buddha discovered the role of mindfulness in being aware of what is happening inside the mind. Therefore the Buddha introduced the new way to perform a meditation, so-called the Buddhist mindfulness meditation, to the world. And in Buddhism, when saying meditation, typically it means the Buddhist meditation or the mindfulness meditation, not the traditional mantra meditation. The mantra meditation was based on reciting a sacred word, then forcing the mind to be concentrated on the sacred word, not bothering with any thinking. The mantra meditation was a common practice among ascetics and Brahmins as a way to gain some kinds of supernatural powers, such as a communication with Deva, God, and spirits. However, the Buddha had no interest in those supernatural powers, but he was interested in searching for the truths of life within nature, and on the day of his enlightenment, during his practice, he realized that the mind was just like a thinking machine, of which there were varieties of thoughts within the mind. Some were wholesome thoughts and some were unwholesome thoughts. The Buddha developed a Buddhist meditation by having a mindfulness with careful attention on his teaching, as something wholesome, because the Buddha taught on how to make the mind becoming steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated as follows.
There are alternatively 5 ways to perform the Buddhist meditation by either of the following actions. 1. Having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining on the listening of the Buddha's words, Dharma, which is the Dharma of the truths of nature as a wholesomeness, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. He is mindful, one who dwells happily. 2. Having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining on the discoursing of the Buddha's words, Dharma, which is the Dharma of the truths of nature as a wholesomeness, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. He is mindful, one who dwells happily. 3. Having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining on the rephrasing of the Buddha's words, Dharma, which is the Dharma of the truths of nature as a wholesomeness, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. He is mindful, one who dwells happily. 4. Having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining on the reflecting of the Buddha's words, Dharma, which is the Dharma of the truths of nature as a wholesomeness, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. He is mindful, one who dwells happily. 5. Having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining on the signing of the Buddha's words, Dharma, which is the Dharma of the truths of nature as a wholesomeness, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. He is mindful, one who dwells happily. By performing with any of the above alternatives, then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated, and this is the way to perform the Buddhist meditation.
It should be noticed that during the Buddha time, there was no paper invention yet, also there was no letters for writing in recording any Buddha's words. Therefore, the only way to study the Buddha's teachings at that time was to remember the Buddha's words by listening, discoursing, rephrasing, reflecting, and marking on the Buddha's words. This is a way to initiate a cognitive process of mind in learning the truths of life within nature in accordance with the Buddha's teachings. During the Buddha time, the technique of having mindfulness with careful attention and determining on the Buddha's word or Dharma was a common tool used in the Buddhist practice, and the collection of short Buddha's words, so-called Dharmapada, of a line or stanza of the doctrine, which was very popular in the Buddhism. During the Buddha time, when practicing, a practitioner must remember at least one Dharmapada for consideration. The success of having a mindfulness, having an attention on the content in the Dharmapada, while the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated in Buddha's words, is very significant because it paves a foundation for having further study of the cores of Buddha's teachings. The innovation of a short Dharma of the Buddha's words for Buddhist meditation in replacing of the short sacred words in mantra meditation was a breakthrough way of meditation beginning during the Buddha time. Everyone who performed a Buddhist practice must remember these short Buddha's words to be used in performing the Buddhist practice by having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness of the Buddha's words, Dharma. Therefore, remembering a short description of Dharma is a necessity in performing a mindfulness meditation. It is recommended that in performing a Buddhist practice, practitioner should have some preliminary study on the Buddha's teachings, and also should remember at least a short Dharmapada or a sutta as a Buddha's words, Dharma, in the Vimadhyayatana Sutta. The Buddha's words, Dharma, Dharmapada, and Sutta are so important in Buddhist practice as the Buddha suggested that by doing so, practitioners would be invincible by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva, God, or Mara or Brahma or by anyone in the world because the Buddha's teachings were already investigated by the Buddha in accordance with the Dharma, and that is how the Buddha is well investigated in accordance with the Dharma as follow.
The Blessed One taught me the Dharma with its successively higher levels, with its successively more sublime levels, with its dark and bright counterparts. As the Blessed One taught the Dharma to me in this way, through direct knowledge of a certain teaching here in that Dharma, I came to a conclusion about the teachings. I placed confidence in the teacher thus. Monks, when anyone's faith has been planted, rooted, and established in the Buddha through these reasons, terms, and phrases, his faith is said to be supported by reasons, rooted in vision, firm. It is invincible by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva, God, or Mara or Brahma or by anyone in the world. That is how. There is an investigation of the Buddha in accordance with the Dharma, and that is how the Buddha is well investigated in accordance with the Dharma.
The Buddha taught the Dharma of the truths of nature. These truths were previously investigated by the Buddha. Therefore, when having mindfulness with careful attention on the Buddha's words, we also will realize the truths of nature to be supported by reasons, rooted in vision, and the mind will be steadied with wholesomeness. In comparison between the Buddhist practice and the mantra meditation, the Buddha explained as follows.
In Brahman's teachings, which are based on keeping your own words, performing mantra meditation, keeping celibacy, giving away to others, learning the mantra. Some of these are good things to practice to keep morality, but when comparing to the Buddha's teachings which are based on truths of nature with clear explanation on the cause and effect, lust like when seeing a fire, I explain you the cause of the light due to the burning of wood and dry leaves, then if we get the wood off, then we can extinguish the fire. So does in my teachings, by performing the Buddhist practice, then you can abandon the 5 hindrances, and then proceeding into the absorption, and an insight observation to gain wisdom, and using this knowledge for the cessations of all defilements within the mind, and finally to liberate the mind. These are the courses of the Buddhist practice. The Buddha's teachings are well explained, and practical, while the mantra practice of mantra meditation and learning the mantra are useless, and they cannot abandon any kinds of defilements, even the 5 hindrances.
The Buddha strongly criticized the mantra teachings and meditation as a groundless beliefs and blind faiths. They were not the study on the truths in nature. The main difference between the mantra meditation and the Buddhist meditation is that, the mantra meditation will force the mind to be stand still by the power of meditation, while the Buddhist meditation will have a mindfulness to abandon any arising unwholesome phenomenon within the mind so that the mind becomes concentrated, and then dwelling the mind into an insight observation, being aware of what is happening inside the mind, seeing the mind as what it really is. In Buddhist practice, we perform the practice to gain insight wisdom first, then later using the wisdom for the cessation of finest defilements. And this is the reason why the Buddhist way to cleansing all defilements is specifically called the cessation of defilements by wisdom. The Buddha clearly differentiated the Buddhist practice from the traditional mantra practices as follows.
These three things, monks, are conducted in secret, not openly. What 3? Affairs with women, the mantras of the Brahmins, and wrong view. But these three things, monks, shine openly, not in secret. What 3? The moon, the sun, and the Dharma, the nature and discipline proclaimed by the Buddha, the Buddha's teachings.
Those people who ignore to study the truths of life within nature, often claim on the secret of mantra as sort of supernatural powers. It is a delusion of wrong view. They do not understand the facts and the science of rain as a vaporization of water to be a cloud in the sky, and then being condensed to be the rain. They claim that there is a god of rain, and fool people to perform a ceremony to praise the god for the rain. The mantra abuses the weakness of fearing something unknown with ignorance. In Buddhism, although there are spirits and life after death, either the good one or the bad one, but all of them are under the law of nature, and none of them can secretly change the courses of nature as by wishing. It is the wisdom based on the facts and science that is the Dharma, the truths of nature, and the Buddha teaches only the truths, not the secret mantras. So, the Buddhist practice does as a way to experiment and to learn the truths of life within nature. There is no any secret practice in Buddhism. Later, after the Buddha had passed away not so long, the same person asked the Venerable Ananda about the Buddhist practice, and the Venerable Ananda explained as follows.
The Buddhist meditation is to have mindfulness to abandon all the 5 hindrances, then proceeding into the absorption, and then performing an insight observation. Thus, entering into the knowledge of previous existence, then entering into the knowledge of understanding how beings reborn, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate, and pass away on according to their actions, so called the knowledge of the ceasing and rebirth of beings, and finally the wisdom of knowing how to cease the finest defilements, taints.
The system of Buddhist practice is exactly the same achievement of the Buddha on the day of his enlightenment. And in order to perform the Buddhist practice correctly, we have to start with learning how to perform the mindfulness meditation rightly. In this study, we have to understand the difference between the mantra meditation and the Buddhist meditation clearly, so that we will not mistakenly perform the mantra practice with ignorance, because the mantra meditation cannot deliver the right concentration of the Noble Eightfold Path. That is, the mantra meditation is performed by reciting a short sacred word, and the repeated sacred word will forcibly suppress the mind to be concentrated. This may seem to be successful for a while, but the unwholesome thought will arise again, so the mind will be forced into an absorption with form and formless perception. In Buddhism, this is not the way to eliminate the problem at the root cause. Therefore, when leaving the absorption, the person is easily trapped into unwholesomeness again. In comparison, the Buddhism is a cognitive process of learning the truths of life within nature by having a mindfulness to be aware of arising unwholesome thoughts, then having the mindfulness to bring in an appropriated wholesomeness to counter the arising unwholesome thoughts, then to abandon the arising unwholesome thoughts, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This is a cognitive process of how a mind will learn how to handle an arising problem correctly. And as the mind is able to abandon all the arising unwholesome thoughts in the 5 hindrance cessations, then the mind will become more steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated, then proceeding into the inner mind to handle the problem at the initial thought with liberated thinking until the mind develops a kind of purified mindfulness, and then it is ready to perform an insight observation of the 4 mindfulness foundation. And this is a whole process of Buddhist practice in accordance to the Buddha's words. There is nothing right or wrong in performing the mantra meditation or the Buddhist meditation, but we have to realize of what we are performing, not confusing, otherwise it will unnoticeably earn to be a kind of ignorance. And then we also should understand that what we are doing will get what is the result. That is, if we perform mantra meditation, then achieving in Brahma concentration, while performing in Buddhist meditation, then the concentration mindfulness will be achieved. In Buddhism, once attaining an empowered mindfulness, then further exploration into the inner mind can be further proceeded in the next step. Clearly, in performing the Buddhist meditation, we should start with learning on how to initiate a mindfulness skillfully first, so that when proceeding into the Buddhist meditation, the mindfulness will automatically become active at all times. On the contrary, if we start the meditation right away without having a sufficient mindfulness development, then unnoticeably may perform into a mantra meditation. Although the mantra meditation was very popular for several thousands of years, but none of them is successful in making an insight observation and attaining an enlightenment before the Buddha. However, for those who is Brahma before, and may be familiar with a short reciting of sacred word in mantra meditation, then when performing the Buddhist meditation, it is necessary to have a mindfulness development first before getting into the Buddhist meditation. When the Buddha introduced this kind of Buddhist meditation to the public, it was considered as a new kind way of performing the meditation, and many of his students who were familiar with the conventional mantra meditation, they also did not quite understand of what the mindfulness meditation was, especially the part of mindfulness in meditation, so they went to ask the Venerable Mahakaccana, was the disciple who excelled in giving detailed analyses of the Buddha's brief statements, and Venerable Mahakaccana elaborated this part of the continuation of mindfulness in the Buddhist practice as follows.
The continuity of mindfulness can be induced in 6 alternative ways as follows. 1. By constantly having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness of the Buddha, such as the goodness of his wisdom, his purity, and his compassion, then the mind will abandon the unwholesomeness, and then the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This kind of technique later is called a recollection of the Buddha. 2. By constantly having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness of the Dharma, such as the Dharma is well proclaimed, the Dharma is to be seen by individual, the Dharma is timeless, the Dharma is inviting for inspection, the Dharma is leading onward, and the Dharma is directly experience-able, then the mind will abandon the unwholesomeness, and then the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This kind of technique later is called a recollection of the Dharma. 3. By constantly having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness of the community of noble disciples, such as this is a community of good conduct, of upright conduct, of right conduct, of proper conduct, worth of gifts, worthy of hospitality, worthy of offers, worthy of salutation, and virtue for the world, then the mind will abandon the unwholesomeness, and then the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This kind of technique later is called a recollection of the order. 4. By constantly having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness of the moralities, then the mind will abandon the unwholesomeness, and then the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. 5. By constantly having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness of the charities or the good things that we have done in the past, then the mind will abandon the unwholesomeness, and then the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. 6. By constantly having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on the wholesomeness on how to be an angel, such as kindness and compassion, then the mind will abandon the unwholesomeness, and then the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This kind of technique later is called a compassion meditation.
The importance of having a mindfulness, then having a concentration, was exemplified on one occasion when the Buddha explained to the Venerable Sariputta on the 37 factors form enlightenment, groups by groups. And later on the Venerable Sariputta elaborated on the relation between the mindfulness and the concentration as follows.
Because of having the faculty in effort, thus it is the basis for the empowerment of mindfulness. Because of having the faculty of mindfulness, thus it is the basis for the empowerment of concentration. And because of having the faculty in concentration, thus it is the basis for the empowerment of wisdom. This is the reason why and how the faith, the effort, the mindfulness, the concentration, and the wisdom, all of them are dependently and progressively related to the faculty and the empowerment quality enhancements during performing the Buddhist practice.
In performing the Buddhist meditation, the mindfulness is very essential in abandoning any arising unwholesome thought, and as a result keeping the mind steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. But in performing the mantra meditation without a mindfulness, the mind will forcibly get into the concentration directly, but it lacks the learning development on how to abandon the arising problem. Therefore, in performing the Buddhist meditation, there is no need to rush into the state of concentration without having a mindfulness first, because in the Buddhist meditation, we are learning about how to abandon a unwholesomeness, so that the mind will become concentrated. And this is the reason why in the Supasutta, the Buddha explained that the mantra meditation can only bring the mind to concentration, but it never be able to abandon any of the 5 hindrances, the lower fetters, at all.